Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Derrell Peel looks at the inventory of cattle and calves across the country. Bryce Anderson forecasts potential weather conditions over the last half of the growing season. Bob Wright describes insect pressures in corn and soybeans, and Paul Jasa talks about the impacts of cover crops to soil health. Oklahoma State Extension's Derrell Peel is our cattle market analyst this week. Live and feeder cattle futures contracts were lower to start this week following key USDA reports Friday. The agency's July inventory report tallied 103 million cattle and calves in the U.S., the most since 2008. And its cattle on feed report showed placements during June were 16% higher than the previous year. The overview of beef numbers is typically a twice-yearly estimate from the USDA, but federal budget issues precluded July releases in 2016 and 2013. We talked with Derrell Thursday morning and started by asking what the inventory stats show about the current state of the industry.
Well, the mid-year cattle inventory report, shows herd expansion. I think that's pretty clear. It's a little hard to interpret this report. We didn't get it last year. USDA has only issued this report 3 out of the last 5 years. We did not get last year, so we don't have year-over-year comparisons. But the all-cattle inventory was up about 3%, or up to about 103 million head, excuse me. And, the beef cow inventory showed to be about 32.5 million head. You can't compare to a year ago, but particularly for the beef cow number, if you compare July to the January number we got, and you look at how that compares historically, it's a fairly large ratio, about 104%. And what that means historically is anytime that was over about 102%, we were typically in herd expansion. So I interpret that at this point to mean that we're probably still adding cows to the herd in 2017.
How do you weigh these numbers short-term versus long-term?
Well, I think longer term, it confirms what we've been saying. I don't think it really changes our story very much. There's some indication in this report, the heifer inventory, the beef replacement heifer number. Again, we don't have year-over-year comparisons, but it's a fairly small July to January ratio, which may indicate that we're slowing down on heifer retention. So I think for me, it confirms that we're still expanding in 2017, but I think the question of whether we continue that expansion into 2018 it still remains to be seen.
Would you say the market reacted more to those inventory estimates or to the latest cattle on feed report?
Well, I think the cattle on feed report really, got everybody's attention. The placement number, of course, was the big news in that. It came in about 10% bigger than expected. So placements in June were 116% of last year compared to 106 that was kind of expected. And so that really dominated the market, I think, and continues to some extent. And I think it's possible to overread that. Yeah, obviously the market just got surprised by the numbers, but if you look at the weight breakdowns, for example, basically what happened was feedlots have had a lot of money. They've made a lot of money the last couple of months. They historically spend that money on buying more feeder cattle when they have money, and so they placed all of the big cattle that were out there, and then they reached down and placed a lot of lighter weight cattle. And so the weight breakdowns confirm that that's where the surprise came, was the fact that they placed a lot of lighter weight cattle. And that means that those cattle are in there now, but they won't be there later. So, again, you can overplay the importance of this in terms of the total numbers. It changes the timing somewhat.
Can you explain where those animals are coming from? There was some thought that because of drought in the north, there would be more cattle placement there, but really it was across the board, right?
It really was across the board. I don't interpret this mostly to be a drought effect. Certainly the drought did have some impacts regionally. There were very large placements, for example, in South Dakota, and you would certainly attribute part of that to the drought. But in general, again, I think the economics of the feeding industry and the profitability that feedlots have had is the biggest contributor to this large placement number.
So from what you see in those numbers and from what we know about animals entering and exiting the feedlot in terms of how heavy they are, what do you think it means for overall supply here as we close out summer and move into fall?
Well, again, if you look at it, we've had 4 months of large placements. The first 2 months of that was almost entirely oriented towards the heavy end of placements. So those are the cattle that'll come out first. Starting in May, we started to place a few more lighter weight cattle. And then here in June, we placed a lot more of the lightweight cattle, and those cattle are going to come out later. So we haven't really created a timing issue. In fact, these large placements in June were lightweight. They're going to come out last. So again, I don't see that we've created a major problem with it here. It's just a question, and we do expect that these placements will not continue to go at the rate that they have the last 3 or 4 months. They should come down on a year-over-year basis. They may still be up, but not up as much as we go forward here through the rest of the summer and into the fall.
The average cost of all fresh retail beef jumped 20 cents from May into June. Do you think this is the start of an upward trend?
Well, I think it's a sign of very good demand at this point. We've enjoyed, choice retail beef prices have increased every month this year, starting in January from the December levels. And that's a bit surprising. We're putting more beef on the market, and we've got increases in both pork and poultry supplies. So, I think it's a sign of good demand. There's no real reason to think that's going to change. I don't know that we'll continue to add to those retail prices because we do know supplies are going to continue to get bigger as well. So I think it would really be a little bit unexpected to see them continue to increase, but the fact that they've maintained and actually increased thus far is a very strong sign. And we're starting from a very good place, even if we do see some weakening of these prices over the next few months.
What's your price forecast here for live and feeder cattle markets?
Well, we're in midsummer right now, kind of the summer doldrums. This fed cattle market has held up stronger than expected. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have just a little bit more weakness here, but we're getting close enough now to thinking about moving into the fourth quarter when we typically see a little bit of seasonal strength in that market. So the bottom line is I think we're going to go mostly sideways. We're probably getting through the summer a little bit stronger than I expected. And we'll probably, again, move mostly sideways to perhaps a little bit stronger as we move into the last part of the year. Feeder cattle, kind of the same story. They've been stronger than expected. They have taken a hit, obviously, after this last cattle on feed report. But in general, we're very current. We've had good forage conditions that have helped feeder demand from a backgrounding and stocker standpoint, and we've obviously had very good feedlot demand, and I don't really see that changing. So again, I think we're going to maintain this thing. Seasonally, of course, calf prices will weaken into the fall. They always do, but we're starting at a very good place and should maintain good prices throughout that process.
Next week, Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Dry conditions across significant growing regions of the country continue to intensify. The latest U.S. drought monitor listed more than 6% of Nebraska in severe drought, the state's worst conditions in more than 3 years. The deterioration is a big shift from the start of the growing season. The High Plains region, which includes Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota, placed only 7% of its area in abnormally dry conditions at the beginning of May. But as we told you previously, last month provided below normal precip for that region and was the second driest June on record in Nebraska with data back to 1895. We talked with DTN's Bryce Anderson Tuesday afternoon in Omaha about the weather outlook for the second half of the growing season, but we started by asking for an overview of current conditions.
Well, right now, Jeff, the scenario we've got is on a large scale. Nationally, it's have and have not regarding rainfall, and the eastern Corn Belt from the eastern third of Iowa on toward Ohio is in an area, a situation where rainfall has been quite plentiful all season. Some cases too much because they have uneven crops in parts of Indiana and Ohio especially. But then over the Western Belt, to nobody's surprise, and I'm not saying anything new, it's been very dry. We've had well under half of our normal rainfall over the past 30 days. And so we're in a situation now where we are looking at a likely drawdown in yield, certainly less than last year and probably even less than trend line. So stressful in the Western Belt, and then much better, maybe even a little bit too much better on rainfall in the Eastern Belt.
In the Western Belt, though, a lot of those areas were in decent shape to start the growing season. I mean, there were some spots that were rough, but where did it all go wrong?
The problem that really hit was that during the month of June, things were so dry that there wasn't that rainfall to help keep the soil moisture profile taken care of during what is usually a pretty good month for precipitation. So now, crops have been forced to draw into their subsoil reserves. Then the dryness out of the northern plains, the terrific drought they've got going on there, has encroached farther south and east into more of Nebraska and then into Iowa.
Leading up to this season, we had talked about the possibility of La Nina or El Nino and what those two things meant. So we're in neutral now, right? And what does that mean? Well,
the neutral Pacific, I think, is going to basically not have an influence on our patterns as we go into the latter part of the summer. So from a final temperature standpoint, as we finish our crops, I think that's probably somewhat favorable because we do have late planted crops in much of the Midwest and much of the Corn Belt. So I think that maybe holds off on keeping an early frost from occurring. But on the other hand, we're not going to change this pattern during August. There still are going to be generally drier periods over the western Corn Belt with temperatures staying above normal. So the prospect of turning around and having some very generous August rains doesn't appear to be happening.
Do you think the conditions have been severe enough to impact overall U.S. yields?
Yes, I do. I think that as far as corn yields, I think that we're going to be certainly 10 bushels an acre less than a year ago. Now, a year ago it was a record, but as far as the comparison to trend, I think we are going to be below trend line now. And if that final yield comes in under the 160 bushel an acre mark, that would be about a 10% decline. And from last year, that would certainly get folks' attention in terms of how we're looking for supplies for next year. Soybeans, there's still a lot of time to go. I mean, we're still talking about a month and a half to decide the soybean outlook and the soybean situation. So I think that right now we can say that it doesn't look promising, but there still is time for that crop to at least kind of hold its own.
Is it too early to start talking about what the growing season could look like down in South America?
I don't think it is because, it's not going to be that much longer until the Brazil growers get going with their start of the season. I think that they're going to be looking at a fairly decent scenario for soil moisture. I don't think that things are going to just ramp up to where they set a new benchmark for production like they did this year in soybeans. And then in Argentina, there's no doubt they're going to have good soil moisture to start out with because they've actually had flooding at the very end of their row crop harvest and at the beginning of planting their wheat. So I think that they will start out in the latter part of this calendar year when they get planting going with very good soil moisture.
Later in the show, Al Dutcher will provide his weather forecast for Nebraska over the next 7 days. Farmers and ranchers will have the opportunity to learn more about pasture and rangeland production at the 2017 Nebraska Grazing Conference scheduled for August 8th and 9th in Kearney. Nebraska Extension's Daren Redfearn outlines reasons producers might benefit from attending this year's event.
The reason you'd want to attend this year's grazing conference is because we have a few things that would benefit everyone regardless of your interest. All the way from managing some more traditional introduced pastures all the way through your more traditional grazing lands. Some of the speakers that we have coming in this year, we have two speakers that are pretty highly sought after. One of them is Jim Garish. You probably have heard of Jim. He's a grazing consultant out of Idaho. Jim's going to be there only on Tuesday only. His morning talk will focus on developing fencing and watering points. And then in the evening, following the banquet, we'll have a workshop where he'll go through some of the same sort of things. The other speaker that we have is Peter Ballerstadt. Peter is the forage product manager for Barenbrug Seeds. Primarily what he's going to address is going to be some of the cool season species that are more useful for irrigated pastures and also dryland pastures. People need to know about registration. The registration closes on August 1st. The early registration does. If you wait until after August, the price does increase to $100 per head. The early registration is only $80.
You can find more details about this year's conference through a link on the Market Journal website. The condition of corn and soybeans slipped in Nebraska this week. The latest progress report lists 61% of corn and 59% of soybeans in good to excellent condition. Each is down 4 points from a week ago. Nebraska Extension's Bob Wright joined us Tuesday on UNL's East Campus research plots to discuss which insects growers should be scouting for, starting with corn rootworms.
Well, right now is when people should be scouting for adult rootworms. Whether to make a decision whether if you still haven't pollinated yet, that they can interfere with pollination by feeding on the silks, but after that they start laying eggs in corn. And if we scout now and make a determination, we can either use foliar insecticides during this season to knock down their numbers, or make a decision as far as whether we want to rotate or change management tactics next year if you're going back into corn.
And is there a definitive need to rotate if you've been using the same type of trait?
Well, that's a good idea. We don't want to, where we've seen problems is where people have repeatedly used the same trait, especially if it's only one Bt protein against rootworms. If you're in continuous corn, I know a lot of the companies are recommending their growers go to a pyramided hybrid, which has 2 or more traits against a particular insect. That's better for resistance management.
Let's have a Japanese beetle update.
Right, they also can interfere with pollination by feeding on the silks, but right now the main issue is in soybeans. They're feeding on this foliage and a lot of other defoliating insects in soybeans right now, various caterpillars. One thing for both the caterpillars and Japanese beetles, they tend to look worse than they are because they're feeding on the upper foliage, and what that does is just lets more light go down into the foliage, into the canopy, and the plant can compensate for some upper canopy damage. But the general threshold is 20% defoliation over the whole canopy in reproductive stage soybeans is what we want to treat at that level.
Aphids an issue?
We're starting to see soybean aphids in northeast Nebraska. This hot weather we had recently really doesn't help soybean aphids. If we get max temperatures down below 90, that's more favorable for their growth and development. So definitely you need to be scouting for soybean aphids. Watch them. They can grow pretty quickly if the temperature conditions are adequate.
Spider mite's a problem.
We're starting to see some reports of spider mites showing up in both corn and soybeans, and particularly plants that are drought stressed. And when we have these high temperatures, that favors spider mites. So that's something to watch for in both corn and soybeans. I know we've seen in corn, we've had reports of some fields in central Nebraska where active colonies are up to the ear leaf, and that's probably where you want to start treating in corn. It's a little less clear in soybeans, but if you're seeing significant leaf injury from spider mites in soybeans and the lower canopy, and they're still actively reproducing, that's something to consider treating.
You can find more information on the CropWatch website about soybean aphid control and corn rootworm scouting. The first of 4 Nebraska Extension crop management diagnostic clinics took place last week at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center near Meade. The event focused on soil health with topics ranging from physical and chemical properties of soil to possible benefits of cover crops in corn, soybean, and wheat rotations. Nebraska Extension engineer Paul Jasa has an extensive background using cover crops and discussed UNL research looking at their impact. We talked with him at the clinic and started by asking about the seemingly increasing interest in using them in a cropping rotation.
Well, you pick up any farm magazine today and there's cover crops that are being featured everywhere. And producers are often asking, why would I want to grow a cover crop? And when they start reading the magazines, they go, oh, wow, that's pretty neat. So the interest is really gaining.
Tell me how you're measuring what cover crops do with the soil.
Well, the interesting thing is we have to choose our cover crop to fit what we want to do to the soil. I myself want to feed the soil. There's some people who want the cover crop to feed their livestock. Those to me are two different things. And so it depends a lot on what you want to do with it. Do I want to reduce erosion? Do I want to digest some residue in the field? Do I want to produce more residue in the field? Then I can choose what cover crop to grow.
What do you mean by feed the soil?
Feed the soil, when it comes to soil microbes, a lot of people think I need to kill everything in the soil. The only thing I want is growing is my roots. Well, the roots themselves are basically little babies there. They can't fend for themselves. The microbes in the soil take last year's roots and residue, breaks it down, release the nutrients for this year's roots to use. It takes the organic matter in the soil, make it in a soluble form for the plant to take up. They're going to cycle everything in the soil, so I want to keep my soil biology active.
In certain crops you're looking at, how diversity is impacted in the soil. Tell me about that.
Well, diversity, it's like when you or I go to a buffet. We don't spend our entire time at the cellar bar or our entire time eating the mashed potatoes. You can get full of mashed potatoes, but pretty soon you're going to be missing something in your diet. Same things on our soil. We want diversity. Worst thing I can do is grow, for instance, continuous wheat. Waste a lot of sunlight and carbon dioxide after wheat harvest, not feed the soil. Continuous corn is about as bad, but at least I'm growing it later into the fall. But if I get diversity in my cover crops, then I can make up for lack of diversity in my cash crops.
And how much of a difference does that make?
Makes a big difference when it comes to keeping the soil microbes happy. I've been in some fields that are continuous corn. They put a cover crop in the fall, which is going to give them some diversity, and they can really build the soil structure because now I got a living root in the soil year round rather than just the 5 months that corn's actively growing.
You're also measuring biomass.
The biomass production is far more important to the guy who wants to feed the livestock. If I'm measuring biomass of above the ground growing things, that's what I'm feeding the cows. But I also look at microbial biomass, so it's below ground. And do I have an active system? Do I have more things growing in the soil? Do I need to feed them?
So what's the difference between corn, soybeans, and wheat in that case?
Well, when it comes to corn and soybeans, both warm season crops, they grow only in the summer, or roughly May through September. We plant them a little earlier, harvest them a little later, but the active root's only there about 5 months a year. Wheat's going to be that winter crop that I seed it in October and harvest it in July, so it's already there a couple months longer. It's got the living root there. Now, it's not actively growing in the dormancy of the winter, but it is still feeding the soil biology because the root is there.
But with the addition of cover crops?
Now I can do a cover crop, say, after wheat harvest, because there's a lot of sunlight, carbon dioxide to be harvested, some water to be used if I can't store it all in my soil. After corn and bean harvest, I got fewer cover crops to choose from, but I can still get the living root in the soil. And again, 10, 11, 12 months a year to have that root in the soil actively growing, maybe 10 months a year. That's how Mother Nature built our soils, having that living root.
Finally, you're measuring one other thing that I can't pronounce and only you can.
Well, the quick term is mycorrhiza, but it's actually verticillary or buscular mycorrhiza. And it sounds odd, but this is a fungi that actually infects the plant roots. It's a good infection. It takes sunlight energy and carbon from the plant. In exchange, it goes out and explores the soil and brings back things like phosphorus and water. It makes the roots more efficient in taking up stuff. So I want the mycorrhiza to be growing in my fields.
And cover crops help that?
Cover crops help that because it's like you and me, we don't want to eat just 5 months a year, we want to eat year round. Well, so do our mycorrhiza, so does our other soil biology that's going on in there. So the cover crop feeds it in the off season when our crop's not growing.
Nebraska Extension's next crop management diagnostic clinic is August 2nd and focuses on using precision ag tools. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. We had a couple of precipitation events during this last week, and the most concentrated precipitation event, of course, occurred on Tuesday and Wednesday as we've seen that cold front driving southward and bringing much more refreshing air into our region. With that cold front passage, we did see some thunderstorm activity develop, and the most concentrated areas were across the Columbus area and Lincoln area, with anywhere from 2 upwards to 5 inches reported in these localized areas, but most of the remainder of the state was generally in the ½ to 1 inch range for the last week. Precipitation total is not going to do enough to really reduce the drought monitor. And if we look at the drought monitor in its most current depiction going through Tuesday 7 a.m., we're looking at severe drought conditions in northeast and north central Nebraska, an expansive area that's been added of moderate drought conditions from northeast through southwest Nebraska and the southern panhandle, and abnormally dry conditions for the remainder of the areas depicted in yellow. Now, as we look at the models for this next week, what we are also looking at for today is high pressure is built in advance of that trough that moved through the region. It's now progressed to the eastern seaboard, keeps us in a northwest flow. High pressure at the surface will bring moisture from the southern United States toward the southern Rockies and then lift it up into the central Rockies and spill it over into the Panhandle. So we're expecting some thunderstorm development across the Panhandle today. And then the high pressure system will slowly edge its way a little bit farther toward the east. We still keep high pressure to our south, and that will continue that easterly flow up into the central Rocky Mountains and push that moisture up into the Panhandle and potentially even as far eastward as the Lexington region with some localized heavy precipitation. Ridge slips a little bit farther toward the east on Monday. High pressure still remains in place, so that's going to block a lot of the moisture into eastern Nebraska, but it's going to continue that feed of moisture around this high pressure system at the surface. Very concentrated moisture across most of southern portions of Colorado and the southern plains. And then the high pressure starts to expand and our temperatures start to rise back up to more seasonal totals. We still have high pressure in place across the southern United States. Easterly flow will wrap that moisture around once again, and we will see still concentrated precipitation across the southern plains, even reaching up into the Panhandle on Tuesday. And then we start to see the ridge starting to break down a little bit, and high pressure though at the surface will be in place, so that moisture feed will still be there. And then as we look at the precipitation with this, still concentrated just to our south. And even north we're moving and we get more significant moisture in the southwest part of the state. Then we start to see some troughing action starting to develop across the central and eastern corn belt, but high pressure system in the southern plains will again keep that moisture flow around it, and that will actually help to feed the moisture with that cold front. So some of eastern Nebraska may actually see some precipitation Thursday afternoon, and then on Friday we start to see that high pressure building in, much warmer conditions in place as high pressure dominates the region at the surface. And in terms of moisture, most of it expands off to our east and to the south. Very heavy precipitation. 8 to 14 day forecast keeps the cooler conditions under those cloudy conditions to the south of us. And in terms of precipitation, very heavy moisture across the southern half of the United States, dry to our north.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the U.S. cattle inventory, weather conditions during the last half of the growing season, insect pressures in corn and soybeans, and the impact of cover crops on soil health. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Next week, Luke Beckman will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Kevin Bradley from the University of Missouri will talk about dicamba injury issues. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.